Hello, welcome to Outside the Studio. This is Tessa. I have the pleasure of chatting with Dominiece Clifton today. Dominiece is Baltimore-based and is a certified yoga instructor and breathwork and meditation facilitator. She's on a mission to enhance overall emotional education and well-being through body-centered approaches to healing. She's also the founder of Move and Still, a mission-driven company dedicated to employee wellness, and Nourish Wellness Collective, which is a hybrid wellness community for women entrepreneurs and working professionals. And since launching Move and Still at the beginning of 2022, she's helped almost 500 beneficiaries from multiple organizations release, reconnect, and remember to achieve emotional well-being and success in life and business. And there's so many more accolades we could add on to this, Dominiece. But instead of me reading it to people, I'd rather introduce you and let you have the floor and add on to any of that if you want to, and just give. I typically like to start off with like origin stories, so kind of like how you got into this work. But anything you want to add to your bio before we start?
I think you summed it up really nice. There's not much I would add to that. I think the only thing that I would add is just I started doing this work. So I guess I entered into the wellness industry after really working through my own healing process.
Mm.
And so that release, reconnect, and remember part that you mentioned is very dear to me because it came to me during a meditation, but I was recalling what my journey has looked like. And I'm sure we'll dive deeper into talking about that today. But I feel really passionate about the work that I do and educating people on stress and trauma just because we hold so much. And a lot of times we don't realize how much we're holding in our bodies. And so, yes, I will just say that like my passion, my own story really led me to do this work. Yeah.
Yeah. I find that's so often the case with things like this, that we as the teachers or the practitioners or I guess the people who hold space for that kind of healing have oftentimes gone through it ourselves. So we have the empathy and not only the training, of course, the training, but like the empathy to be able to understand what somebody might be going through and when they're going through that journey themselves. I think it's so key. So I would love to hear about, how you mentioned going through your own healing. As much of that you want to share that you think is relevant, would you please tell
Sure.
us your origin story.
Yeah. So I'll give you, I guess the Cliff Notes version. So I grew up with a lot of childhood trauma. It literally started with my conception story. So I was born to a teen mom, and then I've never met my biological father. And I always say, like, when I say I've never met, like, not so much as seen a picture. And so that side of my family, like, I don't have any sort of connection. And so growing up with a teen mom and also a lot of my life, a single mom, wasn't easy. My mom also had her own trauma with my conception story. Like, she hid her pregnancy almost up into the end. And so there was a lot of like, fear, shame, just a lot of like guilt with the way in which I was conceived and her being 15 at the time. And so just how we were talking before we hit record, obviously, like, epigenetics is real. I inherited a lot of that. And so at a very young age, I was feeling a lot of emotions that I didn't really know what to do with. And my mom and I didn't have a great relationship. So we never really talked about, the absence of my father or just any of the things that I was dealing with. And so I turned to food at a young age and started overeating. And it was I experienced a very drastic weight gain where, like, 7 years old, I was a normal weight. And then by 8 years old, I was very overweight, and I existed very overweight for most of my life, which contributed to a low self-esteem and just not feeling good about myself, really like going through life, feeling pretty numb, dealing with, like a low chronic depression. And diet, many diets. My first diet was right after middle school. And so I started dieting really young, and that was just how I existed. And I would lose the weight and always gain the weight back, and lose the weight and always gain the weight back. And I remember being like, man, if I can just like figure this out and conquer this, I feel like I would be able to do anything, because it was such a hard challenge. Like, it was such a hard relationship with me. And so just a few years ago, I was at a really low point in my life. This was the end of 19, right before COVID in 2020. And I just got still. I went inward. That was like the only thing I knew to do at that time. And I started focusing on really pouring into myself and focusing on like working on my mind, body, and spirit. And so not just focusing on my body, which is what I had always done in the past. And that time really changed my life. It changed the trajectory of my career path and, plummeted me into entrepreneurship. And I'm doing the work that I'm doing now as a result of just continuing to heal, continuing to be open to exploring different healing modalities. So yeah, I'm really passionate, like I mentioned, just about talking about stress and trauma because I held so much for so long that I did not know I was holding. And like it manifested physically in me being overweight and just some of the things that I was experiencing and behavior in high school, a lot of things, but I didn't know. Like many of us do, like we're just doing the best that we can. And so that's what led me here today. And then today I'm really just, trying to educate people on how it looks when we have unresolved stress and trauma so that people can really, if they are ready, do their own healing work and release the things that they're holding on to.
Yeah. Well, so you said something key in terms of being able to turn inward and do that healing work for yourself. And I think I heard you say you got still. Mm-hmm. And I'm always curious to understand or to ask about what's the impetus for that? How do we learn that might now be the answer, whereas all the other things that we've done before, like the compulsive eating or whatever our addiction is, isn't serving us anymore? Were there little moments in your life that led you to that point? Was there one big aha moment? Were there like mentors and teachers and other people in your lives that showed up and maybe invited you to see things a different way? It doesn't have to be one of those. Of course, like I understand healing is multifaceted and it's multidimensional. And sometimes there's like a myriad of resources that come to our aid. So yeah, would you tell me a little bit more about that process for you?
I would say that after I got started on my journey, a lot of what you mentioned was true. So mentorship and things of that nature. But honestly, at the end of 2019 and in 2020, early 2020, it was just this like feeling, this kind of like intuitive nudge or feeling that I needed to be still and to go inward. And prior to that, I was someone who always like seeked answers externally. And so if I wanted validation or if I was, needing clarity on something, I would be talking to my mom or my friends or like whomever I could go to ask their opinion on my life. And that was how I operated. And I felt like I was always confused because I don't know if you've ever like been stuck on something and asked 2 or 3 people, like everyone has a different opinion. And so you're still like, okay, now I still don't know what to do. And that's typically how I was. So I didn't trust myself at all. Like I didn't have a loving relationship with myself where I was comfortable with like consulting myself first. And that has changed over the years. But so being with myself and like stillness was just not something that I was used to. I was very inconsistent with like meditation in the past and all of those sorts of things. But it was, like I said, I've had a few periods in my life where I've felt like I've been called to stillness since that time. For me, it was just a feeling of like, I was at a really low point. Like financially, things were crazy. My marriage was crazy. I was trying to manage a newborn and a toddler. And then like we're going through a global pandemic. So I felt like my life was literally like upside down. And the only thing I knew was to just like be still, meditate, like hold space for the answers to come to me. And I'm really happy that I did because so much came to me during those, like, it was about 3 months of like being intentionally still. And yeah, that like honoring that, I think sometimes we feel it and maybe we just keep pushing through and ignore it. But honoring that every time I do, it is such a catalyst for so much healing and transformation and just clarity. So whenever I feel that, like I honor that and I'll kind of just like, shut things down, turn away from commitments and begin to like bring things off of my plate and just go into like a few weeks sometimes or months of stillness. And then I come out and I feel like I'm just like ready to take on the world.
Yeah, I love that. I'm always curious too, another follow-up question about stillness and learning to listen to the voice within, that intrinsic validation, that intrinsic knowledge, asking, what are the things I need? How can I hold space for myself? I'm always curious to hear how those answers present themselves and I'm sure there are different ways for different people. Like different modalities for learning, right? Some people see and learn something. Some people have to feel it in their body. Some people have to hear it. So I'm always curious about what it sounds like when you get still, when you ask for that internal knowing, or you ask your questions, whatever it is, right? And you're waiting for that voice, that internal voice to answer you. What does that sound like to you? What is it? I ask personally because I feel like I struggle with this a lot in my own meditation practice, my own healing work. That internal voice I have not listened to for so long that it's so quiet that sometimes I'm like, now, wait a minute. Is that my voice, or is that somebody else's story that's talking to me right now? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I love this question. And I will say for me that this is an ongoing journey, like learning to trust myself again and to honor that voice again is like something that I did not do for so long. And so it's been like reestablishing a relationship with the friend almost, where it's like we're getting to know one another and I'm learning to trust that voice. But oftentimes it comes to me, I hear it. So it comes as like a whisper. And sometimes it comes through like I can remember downloads that have come through so clear where it's like almost like someone literally like whispering in my ear. And I will like jump out of meditation or whatever, restorative yoga, and start like jotting notes and taking notes, trying to keep up with that voice. But usually it comes to me as a whisper. Sometimes I say it comes to me just like as an idea. And I know that it's not from me because it's something that was literally not on my radar. So if I'm pondering a problem and trying to find a solution, like I'm in my head about it and I'm like, I got to figure this out. You know what I mean? Like whatever answers are coming to me when I'm like focusing on it, that's typically my mind. But if I'm just in meditation and all of a sudden something comes to me that I was just completely not even thinking about, I feel like, that is the universe, like dropping a download or dropping, a new idea or new knowledge into my atmosphere when I'm in a space where I'm ready to receive. And so to give you an example of that, when I went through this 3-month period of stillness back at the beginning of 2020, before I started that time of stillness, I was meditating, and I was maybe a few days into just like trying to build out a consistent meditation practice. And a download came to me and it said, for the next 90 days, focus on your mind, body, and spirit every single day. And again, like I came out of that, I took some notes on it, called my husband, was super excited. Like I just got this really great idea while I was meditating and, shared it with him. And I listened to that voice, and I did that every day for 90 days. I poured into myself spiritually. That was meditation, prayer, those sorts of things, like being still and like allowing answers to come to me. I listened to motivational things that really fed my mind, podcasts, YouTube. And then I focused on moving my body every single day. And sometimes that was just going for a walk. Other days it was yoga. Sometimes it was working out from home because we were in quarantine at that time, but it looked different. But I did that for 90 days. And then Tessa, at the end of that 90 days, I was such a different person. And I would have never like thought about that for myself because I struggled with being consistent for so long. And it wasn't something on my radar of like, how can I be better? Like, what can I do? So I feel like a lot of my best ideas have come to me in stillness. And like I said, I know that they're not from me because they're things that are just completely like not even something that I've not even been thinking about, but they're always like really wonderful ideas.
That's so cool. I love that idea. I'm also trying to understand. So I heard you say moving your body every day. I heard you say meditating every day. I'm wondering what the rest of the day looked like during this 3-month commitment, because, you're a mother of 2 children and you're at this point an entrepreneur, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So what does the rest of the day look like?
So I still, to this day, like I still try to practice a similar practice of nourishing myself with mind, body, and spirit. Because I have noticed that I'm such a different person when I take the time to pour into myself that way. I will say that, 3.5 years into it, I don't get to check all the boxes every single day. So there's some days where all I have time for is just listening to a podcast or going to the gym. And maybe at the gym, I can listen to the podcast, or all I have time for one day is like breath work or meditation. So I don't get to do all of those things every single day because my schedule is very full now. Like this was in the midst of COVID, like this was in the midst of quarantine. So I had a lot more time. You know what I mean? Like I was home with kids and like transitioning into being a homeschool mom for a toddler, preschooler, but there was a lot more time. And I, again, had walked away from a full-time job. So I was in the midst of like kind of starting or entertaining the idea of being a coach. But it was just like it came at the perfect time, honestly. But since then, what it looks like for folks that are busy and listening and being like, I don't have any time for that. I try to just maybe allocate 5 to 15 minutes for those three areas. So even if it's just like a 5-minute meditation, I've done something for myself for that day that honors myself spiritually. Even if it's, like I said, listening to a podcast in the car while I'm dropping my kids off. Like, so I'm very creative about how I squeeze that in now, because my days are much more fuller than they were in the middle of the pandemic. But I'm still very intentional about doing that for myself as often as I can.
Yeah, I love that. Very cool. Okay, thank you. That's helpful in terms of, because I always want to incorporate these kinds of things, and I'm sure listeners do too. That's why we listen to podcasts, right? How do we take that realistically and add some of that into our own daily lives?
Yeah,
I also want to, oh, go ahead,
I was
sir.
going to say, I appreciate that question. So when I was a coach, I worked with women that were very busy, and this was something that I ran into often. It's like, I don't have time to do like the things. And as a coach, I empowered my clients to get creative about when you do things. So when you're getting dressed in the morning, what are you doing? Like that can be time where you're listening to something that's motivational and inspiring and is helping you with personal development. When you're in the shower, you know what I mean? Like, what are you doing? Even if you're not listening to something, can you be intentional in the shower about just being present and like making that your meditative moment? So it doesn't have to be, let me sit and cross my legs and like do my own. It could just be like, I'm going to be present for the next like 5 or 10 minutes while I'm in the shower. And I've had so many moments where I've been taking a shower and I've had downloads and intuitive nudges, and I've heard that voice, that whisper come to me. So I don't think it's necessarily like carving out special time in your day when we're already so busy. I think it's about getting creative with the time that you have and just kind of finagling that time and making things fit in.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great suggestion. Thank you for adding that.
Yeah.
I wanted to, so there's a few topics that you're definitely an expert on that I wanted to touch, which first and foremost, diversity, equity, inclusion. And I know you work with different organizations to bring that into the forefront and to make sure it's happening and it's a topic that people are aware of and discussing. So I don't think I have a specific question about it, but I'd love to hear your take on it, what it means to you, how you incorporate this into the workplace for people.
Yeah. So the way I guess, honor or focus on DEI is not so much. So I typically partner with folks that are experts in the DEI field, and we complement each other with our work. And what I have found when it comes to having hard conversations about systemic oppression, race and equity and all of these things, is that these are very triggering conversations, and they're also very mind heavy. And so a lot of times we don't see change within organizations because we are processing through and talking about our problems and like trying to figure out solutions, but we all hold stress and trauma in our bodies. And so however I feel as a Black woman, like we can have conversations about that all day, but the trauma that I've internalized is in my body. Your experience as a white woman, like that is in your body. You know what I mean? Like our experiences as women, like the things that have happened to us because of our gender, or the things that we're seeing happening to other people in the world, we hold that in our body. And so we do ourselves as a society a disservice when we only talk about our problems. I don't know if you've ever had a racial conversation and like noticed how your body felt after. Typically, like those are uncomfortable or sometimes hard conversations. And so you can leave that conversation feeling very tense, very stressed, very overwhelmed, very angry, sometimes, especially as a Black woman. Like I've had many conversations where I've left feeling angry and nothing's been resolved. And so for me, like I am not necessarily the expert that goes in and leads a conversation about DEI, but I'm educating people on the fact that if we're just talking about this, we're leaving something out of the picture that's extremely important to address. And so what I try to do is equip organizations in conjunction with their DEI work, equip them with somatic practices that they can use when they're having these conversations, or even when they're not in conversation, that they can begin to weave and incorporate into their culture to really help their employees and help, their leaders be more empathetic. Because again, like even with therapy, right? Like the way that the brain is is programmed, or the way that our brain functions, a lot of times we, again, approach things from the left side of the brain, which is the logical thinking side of the brain. But we hold our stress, we hold our trauma, we hold those memories and emotions in the right side of our brain. And so again, if we're just talking about race and equity, or we're just talking about mental health and processing our past traumas, we're not doing anything to release. And so that's really how I approach DEI work, and like having conversations and educating people about how it's a both and situation.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. I love that. Well, so on that subject, I do want to talk about it. I do want to, for me personally, I want to be able to have the awkward and hard conversation. I think it's important. I guess I feel like as a white woman, I don't know where to start. I don't feel like it's really my place to say, hey, let's start here. I don't know where to begin. And I also don't feel like it's fair for me to ask you as a Black woman to be like, hey, you tell me what to do. And so I don't, at that point, I'm like, okay, I can educate myself by reading things. I can educate myself. It feels like, okay, then I'm left with like the medium of like, what can I consume in terms of podcasts, talks, literature to educate myself so that I can then go have an informed conversation. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, if you have any comments on it.
Yeah. So again, going back to what I said, I think that if we just educate ourselves and read the books and, consume the literature, we're missing out on the fact that our bodies hold the stress and trauma. So I will use myself as an example. I, up until about a year and a half ago, did not realize the amount of internalized trauma and like oppression that I held as a Black woman. Consciously, I did not think that I was holding inferior feelings, or I didn't like recognize the way that, I had been impacted by racism, because I couldn't consciously and logically point to an experience. Like there was no experience of someone calling me a racial slur, or, like there was nothing like that had happened. Of course, like we're all, I think just in the society that we live in, we deal with microaggressions and those things as people of color, but there wasn't a specific experience. And so I had convinced myself that I had not been impacted by this, which, regardless of whatever our skin color is, we live in a society where we're all impacted by racism and the systems that have been set up for some to win and some to fail. And once I started healing, I started like a lot of this happened for me in restorative yoga, like those moments again of stillness. I started having all of these emotions like bubble up to the surface that I was holding. And then I started to recognize the ways that I did feel really uncomfortable in spaces where I was the other, or I did feel my body tense up when I was having certain conversations, or I recalled memories from like elementary and middle school that I had completely forgotten about. But like these things I held in my body, like these things were not things that I could process through and understand with the conversation. And so to answer your question, if you're thinking whether you are a BIPOC person or, a white person, and you're trying to figure out like, what do I do about this? It starts with your own body, because we hold the things in our bodies. And so, you can read all the literature, but that doesn't change the fact that, if you've watched the news in our world and you've seen how Black and brown folks are portrayed, you might be holding a bias or a story or a feeling or a fear in your body. And no matter the amount of books that you read, like therapy, it can help you to process and call that out. But there's nothing that's going to release that stress and trauma and those emotions unless you like allow your body to release it. And so that's where the somatic work and the body-centered approaches become important. And so we as a society, like we're having so many conversations, but nothing's changing because people are still holding their stories and their experiences and their traumas in their bodies. And so to answer your question, and for anyone listening that's thinking, well, what can I do about this? It starts with yourself. I know that that's like cliche, but it starts with yourself. You know what I mean? Like it starts with you going to do your own work. I can have uncomfortable conversations now and hold space for other people to heal because I've done it for myself first. And so now it's not uncomfortable for me. I don't hold the bias that I used to hold because I've done my work. But so many of us, like we leave the body out of the picture. And so again, like we're just talking through and reading the literature and consuming. But if I'm a white woman, and I walk down the street and I've been watching the news, I might still see a Black man and still be intimidated by that because my body's still holding that story. And so I got to release that. Like I have to do that for myself. There's no book that can educate me on what to do about that.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. I also want to touch on the subject of BIPOC wellness instructors. This is something, again, I'm not really sure how to articulate a specific question on, but I do believe it's an important thing. It's something that I'm seeing more of, by not only BIPOC wellness instructors, but BIPOC specific healing modalities, like a yoga class, for example. What's been your experience with this? What would you add to that conversation?
I decided to get my yoga certification because I felt like there weren't enough faces that looked like mine or spaces that were for me. So prior to being a yoga instructor, my first experience with yoga was over a decade ago, back in like 2011, after graduating college and moving to New York City. In New York City, a place with millions of people and like one of the most diverse cities in the world, I can't tell you how many yoga studios I went in where I was the only Black woman, and I was just completely like not acknowledged by the people in the room or the instructor. And that was my experience. And after having that, whether it was, Vinyasa or Bikram, like after having that experience for so long, for more times than I cared to experience and witness, I stopped going because I didn't feel like those spaces were for me. And I, found other things that I enjoyed to move my body. But representation is so important. We're seeing it a lot more now with, dolls and like for young kids, like toys and movies and cartoons are so much more diverse. But if I think back to when I was a child and I went into a store to buy a toy, I didn't see toys that looked like me, right? Like that was just not like back in the 80s and 90s, like the world was not as diverse as it is now. And so to have those sorts of experience as a child, again, remember, like I can't point to specific times where I was the victim of racism, but like that, it's my lived experience every day. You know what I mean? Like things like that matter. And so when we don't see ourselves in the shows that we watch or the toys that we, purchase, like it becomes like ingrained in you. Like there's this message of you don't matter, or like you don't belong here. And so that was my experience as a child. And then fast forward to being, in my early 20s and going into yoga studios and just wanting to like make my body feel better. And then still having that same experience of like, no one looks like me. No one's even acknowledging me. It's another message of you don't belong here. And so that was my experience with the wellness industry also. And so again, like I just stopped going for a while. And that's what a lot of people do. Like we stop showing up in those spaces. But all of us need healing and all of us need wellness and, deserve to feel like we belong in spaces. And so for me, I came back to yoga many years later through a woman that I found on YouTube that's a yoga instructor, and she's a Black woman. And I was able to connect with her practice. And, there's these like nuances that you wouldn't understand unless you had that same lived experience. And so like to see her hair look like my hair as I was doing yoga and to see the way that she did her hair, like that matters. And so from that experience, I started like recognizing the ways that yoga was impacting my mental health. And like, really, it wasn't just the physical asana for me. It was like, I felt better mentally. It helped my stress. That experience, having that Black woman on YouTube was the reason that I decided I want to become a yoga instructor, because I want to offer more spaces for people that look like me so that they know that they belong in these spaces. And I decided to really focus my organization on making wellness more accessible, because if you think about when you think about wellness, if you think about who typically have access, it's not usually people from low income communities or Black and brown folks. Like you don't Google and see us, but I wanted to like offer that to them because I think that they also deserve access to wellness. And so that's a long way of saying like, so many folks, Black and brown folks that I've talked to have had similar experiences of not seeing ourselves. And so we do create our own spaces to honor, folks, because the reality is that, especially in marginalized communities, like it's much easier to get to a liquor store than it is to get to a yoga studio. And then you're seeing like in the health disparities with Black and brown communities, what's happening as an absence of not seeing ourselves in wellness spaces, not going into wellness spaces and feeling like we're belonging, like that's impacting our health in so many ways. And so a long way of saying it's extremely important representation with BIPOC instructors.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering too, when you say that you weren't acknowledged, what can we do? What specific, let's use me as an example. If I were a teacher in a class that you walked into, what could I do to acknowledge you? I'm assuming that, like, do people not say hello to you? Is
Oh.
acknowledgement must mean so much more than that, right?
Yeah. So I think between my personal story, I will answer this question from my own personal experience and then like horror stories that I've had.
Mhm.
So yes, like literally walking into a space and feeling invisible. Like you see the instructor talking to other people, or you see other people talking to one another. And then it's almost like literally like you're invisible in that space. No one says hello or no one acknowledges you. I've had those sorts of experiences of just not feeling welcome in the space. And then there's also the like the microaggressions and the things that are said that are the things that are said that folks don't realize when they say them, like how they might be offending someone. And so I've had, trying to think of a good story. I've heard horror stories of the way that yoga instructors cue, where they might say something that's offensive to a Black or brown person. Like they're using something like, oh my gosh, trying to think of a good example because I've had a ton of conversations. Okay. I've heard a story where a friend was in a yoga studio and a yoga instructor is trying to cue a specific position and like trying to tell people how to fix their posture. And she said, stick your booty out. Imagine that you have a big ghetto booty and like stick your booty out. And that friend was like instantly just like, wait, what? You know what I mean? Like if you think about the body type of a Black woman, you know, like we're typically wider in the hips and like, you know, a wider butt and those sorts of things. And like that's just how we're made, you know what I mean? And so for someone to say like stick your booty out a certain way, and when you look at the history of like how our bodies have been oppressed and abused, and like hear something like that, that is like a horrendous experience where you don't want to go back to that space because like you can't believe what was just said. And so that's just again like one story, one horror story that has been shared, but it's like those sorts of experiences. So I think it's like being mindful of what you say and just like who's in the space. And even if I'm not in the space, like that's just not appropriate to say.
Mhm.
But being mindful and being inclusive with language. And this isn't just for Black and brown folks. Like I've gone through training and heard stories from folks that are in larger bodies about how they don't feel like they belong in spaces. You know what I mean? And so it's not just if you're a Black or brown person, it's if you're in a larger body or maybe a body that's less able. It's like, how can we all be inclusive and just really like honor the diversity that comes with wellness, and so that it doesn't feel like it's just something for a certain body type or a person that looks a certain way.
Yeah, so important. I think a lot about, as a yoga teacher myself, inclusive language, language that is more inviting of curiosity and less about looking a particular way in any asana, regardless of what you're doing, because at the end of the day, to me, it doesn't matter. Like, to me, it matters that we're being kind to ourselves, that we're exploring our body, its limitations, its edges, its nuances, and getting past that idea of the Instagram worthy or the magazine cover worthy ideal of what we've seen yoga be, right? And particularly in the commercialized modern postural yoga that we see today a lot.
Mm.
So I really appreciate that perspective. I'm curious if you have any, I think the audience is typically fellow yoga teachers, people who are fellow practitioners. Are there any ways that you like to cue classes that allows more inclusivity for wellness in the whole, and more inclusivity, not just, yes, for different races, but also for different body types?
So I will say, based on just what I've learned and sitting in like trauma informed yoga trainings, and again, sitting in trainings that talk about just like honoring all body types, I think the most important thing is giving people autonomy with their practice. And so, for example, I went through I didn't go through the 300-hour trauma training, but I went through a trauma training and they talked about just and folks may already be doing this and not even realizing it, but giving the option, right? Like giving people options of taking a certain posture, or maybe giving a few options of what you can do to alter a posture. Because, for example, if someone, especially for folks that have experienced trauma, the relationship with the body is a very like sensitive and delicate relationship. And sometimes we don't feel comfortable in our bodies, or maybe our bodies were not made to feel like they belong to us and we were taken advantage of. And so like just giving people the option of doing something, or, making it an open invitation, as opposed to, now put your leg this way, or, move your arm that way. Like you don't realize, but just the act of telling someone to do something when, again, maybe they haven't had that freedom over their body, can be very triggering for people. And so it becomes, again, like more open invitation language of, you might want to consider, or, again, like giving people the option of a few different types of poses, which honor different body types. And so for me, I try to use like open invitation language, when you are comfortable, or if it feels good to you, or again, like maybe you want to, when you're ready, like moving into this posture. And so that is the way that I have been trained from a trauma-informed approach, is just like giving people the freedom to choose, and not just like guiding and directing someone and assuming that everything works the same for all people. I've also, again, like been in yoga classes where I was trained in, it was called bus stops, like kind of giving people like different forms of a similar posture. I've been in classes where we just go straight into the hard posture and I can't do it. So then I feel like, oh, this sucks. Like I can't do that thing. So I try to be very intentional. I also work with like a lot of older folks and bodies that are very limited. And so it's okay, you can do it this way, or you can do it this way if that feels comfortable. So like giving people 2 or 3 options to reach the same pose, and then letting them choose what feels good to them. So those are just some of the ways that I have found that work for the folks that I work with. And then the things that I have been taught through, going through, like I said, trying to take a more trauma-informed approach to being a yoga instructor. And then the last thing I'll say when it comes to body types, again, like sitting in a restorative yoga class very recently and having a woman in larger body talk about, like, again, sharing horror stories of her experiences, not talking directly to someone. So like, oh, well, what if you tried this, or what if you do that? But like making it more, again, like open and invitational, where it's like, you might want to try to move your body this way, or try this variation of the pose if you find this pose to be challenging or uncomfortable. And so instead of like pinpointing the woman in the class who is larger and everyone can see that you're talking to her, like how can you say something that just becomes an invitation for everyone in the class? And this is like language that comes directly from the woman who does have a larger body and has talked about her experiences.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I wanted to go back to our conversation around DEI and something you said about releasing stress from the body. And I think that's such a great, it's a great practice to add into our lives for any situation that triggers some sort of stress in the body. And so I'm wondering if you have any best practices, or if you have a favorite practice to release stress from the body.
I love breath work, or pranayama, as a practice to release stress. And I love it because we always have access to our breath. And so going back to this conversation of DEI, and this, I think your podcast is important because it talks about like coming out of the studio and like, how can we use these practices when we're off the mat and in our everyday lives? You don't always have time to like roll your yoga mat out and like get the stress out of your body, but you always have time to breathe. You always have time to pause and be intentional about taking a few breaths when you feel triggered. Before you respond, before you react to something, you get to choose how you respond. And so breathwork has been really helpful for me in my own healing journey, because I can't tell you the amount of times that I've been in a breathwork practice and I've had memories begin to bubble up to the surface of things that I didn't even realize I was still holding, and then allowing myself to really process and move through. So those longer, like meditative practices have been helpful. But I'm a mom of 2 very wild young children who are like major triggers for my body. And so sometimes breathwork is just practical and helpful in the day-to-day where I just need to like pause and take a moment before I yell at my children and go off on them. And sometimes it doesn't work because I'm not perfect. And like sometimes I do respond in a way that I don't feel good about. But breath work at least helps to like bring me down from that so I can take a moment to be self-aware and then go apologize to my children for the way that I responded. And so my go-to practice for folks is like starting with the breath because we always have access to it. And it doesn't have to be any special type of practice, or any special type of pattern. Just being intentional about like breathing deeply into the belly and like really engaging the diaphragm fully and like taking the breath all the way up to the chest. A couple of breaths can make a big difference, especially for folks who are typically under a lot of stress and we don't realize that, like we're breathing shallow, we're breathing from the chest. Can't tell you how many times I've just opened up a meeting or a workshop and just told people to breathe deeply for a minute or two. And they're like, wow, like that made such a difference. And I didn't realize that I was like almost holding my breath. And so it doesn't have to be like anything fancy or special. We just have to be more intentional about like really taking some deep breaths.
I love that. So this might be similar and maybe overlap in your answer, and that's totally fine because I feel like the more we hear things, the better. But in terms of resetting the nervous system or tapping into parasympathetic response, or at least balancing between sympathetic and nervous and parasympathetic response, are there any other practical tips or tricks that you would add to breath work?
Yeah, so physical movement is the most efficient way to release stress from the body and to really begin to reset the nervous system. And so if folks have time, right, like I believe in like having different practices for different points in the day or different days of the week. And so, if it's the middle of the workday and you feel like you're stressed in that moment, you might just be able to take a few breaths at your desk or, from home at your dining room table or wherever you are. But once you get home or once you finish your workday, physical movement becomes really like one of the best ways to release stress from the body. And so any sort of movement that feels good to you, whether it's going for a walk, some days I just like to go for an evening walk and like let myself kind of come down from my day. That's also great for folks who do have children because I will take my children with me and let them run and like burn off energy. And, I'm getting in like that moment to let my body release and completing some stress cycles. Might be yoga, it might be swimming, whatever it is for you, going for a hike, you know what I mean? Like you can get creative of what that looks like based on what you enjoy. But I find that is the number one way to release stress and reset the nervous system. And, like you're an instructor, you just feel that like that. It's like an instant release when you do that. You feel the endorphins, you feel that like that high after yoga. So if you have time and you can honor your body in that way, my next practice after breath work or my next recommendation would be to move your body.
Yeah, so good. I think the biggest barrier to people that I work with and that I've experienced with myself when I get into a rut is just the starting of it. The force or the inertia that sets in at the end of a long day when we're already stressed out and feeling kind of drained. And I don't know, maybe our nervous systems are just overtaxed and we're tired. The barrier to that tends to be that I feel like mentally, I don't have the energy to even pick myself up off the couch and take myself for a walk. Do you have any suggestions when that's the case?
My go-to when I don't have anything left, but I want to move my body is restorative yoga. When I have those days or those evenings or like I'm on my cycle and I'm like, I cannot do anything, I will just let myself be held. And that, tends to be enough as well. And so I am really happy that you answered this question because I don't think it has to be like, you know, um, a lot of exertion or like anything that wears you out. Typically when people hear physical movement, they might think about like going to the gym or going for a run. And like, sure, sometimes that's great. And if that's your thing, wonderful. But like, that's not always our thing. Or like maybe today that you don't feel like that. And so, yeah, like if you're just like, I don't have anything left to give, grab, even if you're home and you don't have a bunch of fancy props, sometimes I literally will just prop myself on the couch, take a midday break, like put my legs up on pillows. And like that is a way to allow my body to release and allow my nervous system to reset, like being intentional about just pausing. So restorative yoga or anything that mimics restorative yoga or restorative posture can be really helpful. And it doesn't have to be holding a ton of postures. You can do one posture that feels good, hold that for 10 or 15 minutes. And then at the end of that, I'm almost certain that you're going to feel a lot better.
Yeah, for sure. Now I feel the invitation to go lay on. I think one thing that I love to do restorative wise is just lay on the hard surface of a floor, stretched out on my back. Wow, the sensations that come from that. It's wild. And yeah, I agree 100%. Legs up the wall or support underneath the backs of the knees. Oh, so good. It's calling to me. Dominiece, is there anything that you wish we would have touched on? Are there any questions that you hoped I would have asked you? And if the answer is no, then I have a follow-up question or a different question.
Yeah, I think the thing that is top of mind for me at this point, especially for all the folks that are listening, if many of them are practitioners themselves, is like oftentimes we can like be thinking about what do I need to do to get this right? Like we talked about like language and those sorts of things. But again, like I think it goes back to doing the work for yourself because you naturally begin to be more conscious, be more aware, like show up from a more loving space, show up from a more inclusive space when you are doing the work for yourself, when you're allowing yourself to release the biases and the things that you might be holding because we've all been conditioned, you know, to fit into the bubble of society. And so yeah, it again, like I don't think there's a ton of study that has to happen. I don't think you got to go read a whole bunch of books and, you know, become an expert on a subject. I think that if folks just do their own work and lead from love and like lead from the heart, then even if you don't say the right thing, like people are more open to, more open to like hearing what you have to say and being receptive because they can see when it's genuine and authentic. I think the challenge with so many people in society is that like they are not genuine and authentic and they're just trying to check the box and get it right. And so if we can like undo that thinking and just think like, how can I just show up from a place of being authentic and genuine? Even if you say the wrong thing, like it's still going to be okay.
I love that. Well, okay, so maybe I do have a follow-up question to that. And that is that as an entrepreneur, as a female entrepreneur, I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of building a brand, building a business with that in mind, leading from love, leading from authenticity. I personally get so caught up in what's the conventional wisdom here. You know, what boxes do I need to check in order to be successful, in order to build a business that is financially sustainable, that provides me with some independence, that, you know, helps me make an income. But then it's like we get caught up in checking the boxes of that. And the voice of love and compassion gets really lost. At least it does for me. I don't feel like I'm alone in that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I would say I'm speaking from my own personal experience. It is an ongoing space of coming back to. So like, it's easy to get away from that and to get consumed in the noise. And like, you know, for me, I would say my first couple of years in business, I invested in so many business coaches because I was waiting to find that person who was going to tell me the things that I needed to do to be successful. And what I kept finding was like, I would try someone else's technique and it didn't feel right, but I would like force it because it's like, well, I've invested all this money and like it worked for them. So surely if I work harder, it has to work for me. And I just felt like I was swimming upstream, going the opposite of the current for years. And I'm grateful for that experience because it helped me to understand like what it feels like when I'm not operating in a place of alignment. But that wasn't me working from a place of authenticity. That was me like doing the things to check the boxes because this is what people told me I needed to do to be successful. And so in the last few years, like literally like the last like 18 months, it's been just like being okay with doing things my way. So I am someone, for example, I'll give you an example of what that looks like for me. Social media, I'm a projector in human design. And so I am depleted of energy very easily. And social media is one of those places that just like depletes me of energy. But for years, I just kept showing up and going live and like doing all the things and posting all the posts because all the business coaches told me like that's what I needed to do. And recently I was like, I'm not going to do that anymore because like I don't enjoy it. It doesn't feel good. The energy that I'm putting out when I'm forcing myself to do that is not the right energy for it. And so I'm not getting the results that I want to get. And like I'm just miserable. And I just, started declaring that I'm going to build a business that's successful that doesn't rely heavily on social media. Not that I won't use it ever, but like I don't want all the pressure every day to show up and like have to post and do the things, be a part of the rat race that is our society right now. And I have gotten many opportunities and, many things have come to me and I've been connected with people. Like things have come in the midst of deciding that I was going to do it my own way. And so I had to lean into that though. Like I had to be okay with that because for a long time, even though I didn't feel comfortable with that method, I was still forcing myself to do it because I felt like it was the right thing. And so that's just, like I said, one example of what it means to be authentic. I think another thing for me has been being okay with things not being perfect. Which I know a lot of people can relate to because we all are conditioned to be perfectionists and like to overachieve and get it right. But it's like if I show up from a place where I know that I have done my best for this, like even if I again like I don't say the right things or they don't come out the way that I wanted them to say, I'm not going to spend time like over rehearsing things to like show up perfect. I'm going to focus more on telling my story and showing up authentically. And the people that are meant to resonate with that will resonate with that. And the people that, it doesn't resonate with them, that's okay. Because maybe they will connect with the beat of someone else's drum. Like I am not intended to reach and touch everyone. There's billions of people in the world. And so just recognizing that, like, I'm not going to be everyone's person and like, that's okay. And kind of moving away from people pleasing and having to be accepted has been a huge part of my journey as an entrepreneur, trusting that like I will make the impact that I'm intended to make and reach the people that I'm intended to reach by just being 100% myself.
I love that invitation that it's I love everything you said, but I also love the invitation that it's a coming back to. It's and because that to me feels like an invitation for compassion, an invitation for kindness, an invitation to be like, oh, there we are again, getting caught in that rat race. And we can acknowledge, it's just like meditation, right? Like we forget the breath, and the success in coming back to the breath is the practice of meditation. So I love that. Thank you, Dominiece. So you also have your own podcast, The School of Healing. There's so many different ways that people can connect to you. If you want to, do you want to say anything about the School of Healing before we wrap up?
I will say something brief. So when you read my bio, and I'm saying this because it goes to what you just said about that coming back to. I think that I have found for myself and just the folks that I've been able to connect with who, have also said yes to a healing journey because it's not easy. That the work is not like who what am I trying to say? The work is we get so focused on like this like future version of ourselves and like do all this work because we think that we're like working to become this different version of ourselves. But I found that it is a remembering process. And so it's like going back to and allowing yourself to remember, like before I started wearing all these stories and listening to all this outside noise, like who was I? Like asking that question and just getting back to that. And so it's not so much of like trying to morph into and become this other version of yourself that you think like is going to be accepted by the world. It's like pausing to remember, who am I? Like asking those tough questions and just allowing yourself to remember that version of yourself. And then like once you begin to uncover and unearth that version of yourself, like being okay with walking in your truth. And so the podcast for me is a way to share modalities that help people to remember, because I think that that is really what we're all doing. Like we all came here as perfect beings, having this human experience, but all like coming with our light shining so brightly. And then slowly over time, it just becomes dim. And so it's like, how do I go back to this version of myself where like I wasn't afraid to let my light shine? And that's like the remembering, that's the journey, that's what the podcast is really geared towards. It's like helping people to find their own light again.
Yeah. Oh, that's so cool. I love that. And how do you, you're on Instagram, you're on LinkedIn, you have a website, Move by Still, or how you would say Move and Still. but it's MOVEXSTILL.com. I feel like after
was taken, and so I had to be creative with the website, unfortunately. So it's MoveX Still, and the X is just like an and sign. But that's my website. I would say that I'm still on Instagram and LinkedIn. Like I still show up to those spaces, but again, like I'm just kind of getting back to like, I'm letting go of at the end of the month, the team that I have been investing in to like help me to post and show up and do all the things. And so I'll still be there, but it'll be more of my own presence and like, seeing more of me and not so much of like all the things that I have been sharing previously. So I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn as Dominiece R. Clifton if anyone wants to stay connected.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, I really appreciate your time and your wisdom, your grace, your compassion, and yeah, all of those things. Dominiece, it's been such a pleasure to get to know you and speak with you today. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. And I must say, as a podcast host myself, that I always appreciate when people ask like thoughtful questions. And your questions today were very thoughtful. And they caused me to stop for a moment and think and answer. So thank you for being a great host.
Well, everyone, that concludes another amazing episode of Outside the Studio. I hope you enjoyed yourself. I hope you learned something new, maybe remembered something old, maybe felt inspired to apply something to your life. You can hear my dog in the background. She's doing a little happy dance. So Daisy enjoyed it. Anyhow, I wanted to just pop in here to wrap us up to say a couple of things. Number one, I have such an amazing team that helps me put these podcasts together. Without them, I wouldn't be able to bring these amazing conversations to you. So thank you to my producer, my director of creative services, my sound editor, my engineer, Consistency Media. Don't know what I would do without you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And the amazing creation and artistic musical genius, Drew Lovern. Thank you so much for putting together this music specifically for Outside the Studio. So unique to the show, only place you're ever going to hear it is right here. Thanks, you guys. You make my world go round. Stay well, everyone. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review, share on the socials, especially if it's a show that you think, hey, this could help somebody else. That's what this is all about, right? We're sharing information so that we're better, so that we're inspired, so that we're lifting each other up, and we're learning how to be in this world, living on this planet to the best of our ability, sharing information and inspiring one another. And that's my hope. That's my hope for the show. Take care.